December 8, 1941, in the humid darkness of Kota Bharu, Malaya, the men of the Imperial Japanese Army landed with the conviction that they were the spearhead of divine destiny. Their invasion began just hours before the attack on Pearl Harbor, demonstrating the breathtaking scope and coordination of the Empire's plan. They moved with a speed that paralyzed the British defenders, not just overwhelming them with numbers, but psychologically shattering them with audacity. The Japanese soldier, initially deployed, was not merely a fighter, he was a revolutionary tool, imbued with the sacred mission to liberate Asia from Western corruption and establish the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. This faith, this unwavering loyalty, was the product of decades of intense ideological conditioning. The concept of Bushido, the way of the warrior, was resurrected and molded into a state religion demanding absolute fealty to the emperor, a living god. To die in combat was the highest honor, a spiritual promotion that elevated the soldier to the revered Yasukuni shrine. To serve, conversely, was an unthinkable disgrace, not just to the man himself, but to his family and the spirit of the nation. This ideological purity was arguably their most potent weapon in those initial months. It meant that even when cut off, even when starving, the soldiers were expected to fight until the very last breath, preferring self-destruction to the humiliation of capture. In those early, heady days of triumph, from the lightning sweep through Malaya and the shocking fall of Singapore, to the capture of the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies, the Imperial Army seemed unstoppable. Their equipment, while often lighter and sometimes less sophisticated than their American and British counterparts, was tailored for mobility and jungle warfare. They preferred bicycles to heavy trucks, and their reliance on infiltration and the bayonet reflected a belief that individual spirit and tactical maneuvering would always overcome sheer material advantage. They looked down upon the perceived softness of the Western democracies. They saw an enemy burdened by comfort and excessive supply lines, and they believed their own simplicity, their willingness to subsist on the bare minimum, was a sign of moral superiority that the decadent Americans could never grasp. They were an army built on Spartan austerity and absolute psychological commitment, operating under the assumption that logistics would be secondary to morale. And for the first 6 months, that assumption held true. The initial campaign was a logistical miracle, succeeding largely because the Japanese advanced rapidly and often captured vast Allied stockpiles, providing temporary sustenance and fuel. They were lean, efficient, and convinced of their invincibility, achieving victories that stunned the entire globe. But as the war progressed, and as their initial gains stretched the fragile supply lines thin across thousands of miles of contested ocean, the brutal reality of modern industrial warfare began to assert itself. The American logistical machine, slow to start, was about to begin churning out steel, oil, ammunition, and rations in quantities the Japanese High Command had never foreseen and certainly could not match. The glory of the initial charge was slowly, inexorably, giving way to the grinding despair of deprivation, leaving the loyal Japanese soldier to face an enemy whose very abundance would become a weapon. December 4th, 1942, on the slopes of Mount Austin, Guadalcanal, the Japanese soldier faced an enemy far more insidious than the Marine, with a Garand rifle. That enemy was the logistical collapse behind him, a slow, agonizing constriction that turned the dense jungle into a tomb. For the thousands of Imperial Army troops huddled on the island, the glorious promise of quick victory had evaporated beneath the merciless pressure of American naval and air supremacy. The supply corridor, known to the Japanese as the Tokyo Express, had been fatally disrupted. What began as an occasional disruption quickly became a complete strangulation. The official military ration, rice, canned meat, and dried vegetables, had disappeared for most frontline units by mid-November. The men were placed on half rations, then quarter rations, and then simply on hope. Their meager remaining supplies were scattered, wet or destroyed by American artillery fire, which seemed to target every attempted depot with uncanny precision. Japanese command attempted to parachute replacement supplies, but the winds and the dense jungle canopy ensured most packages landed miles away from the intended recipients, retrieved by the Americans, or simply rotted on the rainforest floor. Starvation quickly became the single defining element of the campaign. The soldiers transitioned from fighting men to desperate scavengers. They learned to identify the poisonous fungi, the tolerable roots, and the inedible nuts. They hunted rats, lizards, and the slow, weary land crabs, boiling anything they could catch with the brackish water of the jungle streams. Diarrhea, dysentery, and malaria swept through the ranks, exacerbating the caloric deficit, stripping muscle mass from already thin bodies. Their faces became hollowed and skeletal, their uniforms draped loosely over frames ravaged by disease and hunger. Yet, this physical suffering was compounded by a profound psychological shock rooted in the obscene disparity of resources. As the beleaguered Japanese units retreated deeper into the jungle, they often stumbled across the recently abandoned positions of the American 1st Marine Division or the Army units taking over the line. What they found there defied the very concept of military scarcity they were furring. The American field kitchens, which had served hot meals days earlier, left behind mounds of refuse. The Japanese soldiers, trained from youth to respect every grain of rice, were astonished to find half-eaten cans of peaches and pineapple simply discarded into burning pits. They discovered entire unopened boxes of K-rations, prepackaged meals complete with cigarettes, toilet paper, and candy that had been thrown out because the flavor profiles had become monotonous to the GIs. A Japanese soldier risking his life to boil a handful of spoiled rice was now faced with the undeniable evidence that his enemy was literally throwing away food that could sustain his entire unit for days. The dumps revealed discarded boots, perfectly serviceable uniforms, and even weapons deemed outdated or slightly damaged. To the Imperial Army soldier, whose every piece of equipment was sacred and irreplaceable, this level of waste was not just shocking. It was a terrifying demonstration of industrial might. It was here, amongst the refuse and decay, that the true crushing reality of the war hit home. The Americans were fighting with an inexhaustible mountain of supplies, while the Japanese were reduced to fighting over scraps in the dirt. The Japanese High Command, aware of the horrific conditions but unwilling to admit defeat, began referring to the island by the unofficial Jigoku no Tokoro, the place of hell. The men had little ammunition, almost no medicine, and were now too weak to mount offensive attacks, save for suicidal banzai charges driven more by desperation than strategic necessity. By the turn of the new year, the primary orders issued to many units were not about flanking maneuvers or capturing enemy positions, but simply how best to forage. Thousands perished, not from marine bullets, but from the slow, relentless violence of starvation, their bodies dissolving back into the mud beneath the constant heavy rain. This failure on Guadalcanal would become the template for the rest of the island war. The Japanese soldiers were destined to fight and die far less from American firepower and far more from the utter absence of a functional supply chain. January 29th, 1945, 2 p.m. at Luzon, Philippines. As the Americans hopped westward across the Pacific, leaving behind scorched islands and ruined airfields, the supply crisis only deepened. transforming the Japanese defense into a continuous, draining struggle for the most basic sustenance. For the Imperial Army soldier, the enemy was no longer solely the Marine in front of him, but the gnawing emptiness in his own stomach, a constant, debilitating pain that quickly eclipsed the fear of combat. Commanders issued increasingly desperate directives, instructing troops to become entirely self-sufficient in environments that offered nothing but hostile jungle and volcanic rock. The meticulous military planning that characterized the initial phase of the war dissolved entirely into grim, daily survival protocols. A unit's effectiveness was measured less by its ammunition count and more by its success in foraging. Soldiers learned with terrifying speed to identify every edible root, however bitter, and every insect, however repulsive. Rations of rice disappeared completely, replaced by boiled jungle ferns, which caused violent dysentery, but momentarily satisfied the body's frantic demand for bulk. Maggots found in decaying wood became essential, if horrifying, sources of protein. Slugs and large land snails, normally ignored even by native wildlife, were collected by the handful and boiled in rusty helmets, the resulting viscous stew offering only meager caloric relief, but staving off the immediate collapse that death by starvation promised. The most prized meal, however, was the jungle rat. These animals, often larger and tougher than their urban counterparts, became the ultimate target. Teams of men, often armed only with sharpened sticks or their bare hands, would spend entire nights stalking these creatures in the undergrowth, their efforts driven by a terrifying primal hunger that suppressed the usual fear of disease. When a rat was successfully caught, it was not shared equally. It was often skinned and cooked immediately, over the smallest possible fire hidden deep beneath the canopy, protected not only from allied spotter planes but also from the jealous, desperate eyes of comrades, whose own hunger might drive them to violence. In the late stages of the war, particularly on islands like New Guinea, Bougainville, and parts of the Philippines, the Japanese soldiers became ghosts of their former selves. Emaciated figures whose uniforms hung loosely over frames, ravaged by beriberi, malaria, and chronic dehydration. They moved sluggishly, often unable to muster the strength to carry their rifles, prioritizing instead the weight of a water canteen or a single sack of potentially edible roots. This extreme privation eroded discipline and tradition at the edges. The strict, almost fanatical codes of honor that governed the Imperial Army were replaced by the primitive, all-consuming imperative to survive. When a soldier succumbed, his death was often silent, unnoticed by his immediate comrades, who were too weak or preoccupied to provide a proper burial. On certain isolated, forgotten battlefields, where American lines sealed off all avenues of escape and resupply had ceased for months, the desperation reached a point where historical records quietly testify to the ultimate breakdown of human restraint. Acts carried out not from malice, but because the jungle had simply ceased to yield any other form of sustenance. The Japanese High Command, even when faced with overwhelming evidence of these catastrophic supply failures, refused to adjust their strategy. They continued to demand that garrisons hold positions until the very last man, believing that the soldiers' spiritual strength could overcome material deprivation. This delusion proved fatal, guaranteeing that in the later Pacific battles, Japanese combat casualties would be dwarfed by the number of soldiers who simply perished from disease and famine. A macabre, predictable toll paid in full by men forced to fight against the very nature of the jungle itself. The command came down from the skeletal officer. Patrol 12 men deep into the jungle, aiming for the perimeter that marked the territory of the Americans. They were not looking for strategic targets, nor were they tasked with mapping enemy defenses. Their singular, desperate objective was to find sustenance, anything that might sustain the dying company. To cross that line was to step directly into the maw of death, but starvation had long since stripped away the paralyzing fear of combat, replacing it with the dull, aching urgency of the empty stomach. The men chosen for this grim foraging mission were those who could still manage a slow, painful shuffle, their uniforms ragged husks, clinging to shoulders sharp as knives. They moved through the thick undergrowth in silence, the rustle of their movements masked by the constant, indifferent hum of the jungle insects. Their rations had been exhausted weeks prior. Now the diet consisted of boiled roots, the occasional lizard, and rainwater collected in cupped leaves, a meager sustenance that ensured slow dehydration and a predictable decline into delirium. For every 1,000 yards they advanced, the risk of simply collapsing and dying where they lay was as high as the risk of encountering an American patrol. The men understood this silent covenant. If one fell, the others would leave him to the jungle floor, conserving what little energy they had left for the primary mission, survival. After nearly 2 days of agonizing movement, marked only by the shifting angle of the sun through the canopy, the lead scout signaled a halt. Just ahead, the organized chaos of the American presence was palpable, not through sight or sound of battle, but through the unnatural order of disturbed earth and the faint, sweet and sour stench of mechanized waste. This was the promised land, the forbidden zone they called the rear area. The scout pointed toward a narrow draw where the Americans had created a rudimentary dumping ground, a place where the excess of the modern industrial army was casually cast aside. What they found staggered them into a momentary, almost spiritual silence. The sight was immense, a mound of debris that in their eyes represented unthinkable riches. They saw crates, broken but still lined with waterproof paper. They saw mounds of half-burned garbage where metal glinted. Carefully, hesitantly, the Japanese soldiers moved in, transforming instantly from warriors into desperate scavengers. They ignored the truly spoiled organic matter, moving straight for the packaging, the tins, and the abandoned equipment. One soldier, Private Kenjiro, let out a choked sound, falling to his knees beside a heap of flattened tin cans. These cans, once containing canned peaches or highly processed beef, were not discarded because they were empty. Many were only partially consumed, perhaps a quarter of the contents still clinging to the lining. Thrown out because the American soldier had grown bored of the taste or because the can opener had failed to fully seal the lid, Kenjiro scraped the residue out with a trembling finger, licking the sweet, sticky film of fruit syrup, a concentration of sugar and calories that rivaled a week's standard Imperial ration. Another man discovered a pile of discarded communication wire, still insulated and completely usable. For the Japanese Army, functioning wire for field telephones was an extreme luxury, often replaced by runners or makeshift visual signals, leading to command disintegration in dense fighting. This American unit had simply discarded hundreds of yards of perfectly good wire. Nearby, stacks of empty shell casings, discarded but intact, represented precious scrap metal that the Japanese home industry would have moved mountains to retrieve. The most profound shock, however, came from the sheer volume of consumable waste. Here were half-eaten loaves of bread, slightly moldy but easily salvageable after scraping, cigarettes, sometimes entire packets, ruined by water but meticulously separated and dried by the Japanese, and most astonishingly, partially filled jerry cans of water. The Americans dumped clean, potable water because it was slightly stale, or because they preferred the flavor of a newly opened container. For the starving patrol, the water alone was worth the immense risk of the mission. The realization settled upon them, not as anger, but as a deep, chilling dread. The enemy they faced was not just superior in armor and air power, but in the casual, contemptuous way they regarded material goods. An entire Japanese battalion could have subsisted for a month on the supplies the Americans discarded in a single week. Their mission, predicated on spiritual superiority and austerity, was a grotesque joke in the face of this material tidal wave. They gathered their bounty: a few tins of half-eaten beans, some strips of leather that could be boiled for a few calories, and dozens of discarded matchbooks, and melted back into the shadows, suddenly understanding with dreadful clarity that they were fighting an enemy whose trash pile was better provisioned than their entire front line. They carried back not just supplies, but the devastating knowledge of the true imbalance of the war. The reconnaissance reports of the subsequent nights were no longer focused solely on enemy troop movements or gun emplacements. They centered on identifying the true boundaries of American supply operations. What had been a shocking anomaly, a single fortunate discovery, soon became a grim, deepable target. To find the periphery of the sprawling enemy installations, the Japanese patrols learned to rely on an entirely different set of markers. Olfactory markers. The humid, tropical air that usually carried the smells of decay, wet earth, and sweat now carried something alien. It was the rich, cloying, unmistakable scent of excess. It was the sharp tang of hundreds of tins of beef that had been opened but not finished, the metallic, fatty residue of industrial-grade grease used for frying, the faint chemical sweetness of thousands of discarded cigarette butts mixed with the heavy preservative odor of waxed cardboard and packaging materials. This was the smell of a machine they could afford to waste. To the starving Japanese soldiers, navigating by the sound of heavy trucks or the sight of distant generator lights was perilous. But navigating by the smell of abundance was precise. The American camp engineers, following regulations, designated refuse collection points, often a deep gully or cleared swath downwind and downhill from the main bivouac. This zone, intent to contain disease and sanitation issues, quickly became a bizarre, macabre magnet for the Imperial forces. The scent would intensify gradually, starting as a vague promise on the wind, hardening into a concentrated, sickening perfume as the patrol crept closer. This designated dumping ground, known informally among the Japanese infantry as Yankee's Kitchen, was usually marked by heavy churned mud and the incessant buzzing of flies attracted not by human corpses, but by discarded processed foods. It was here, 30 or 40 yards outside the conventional perimeter wires, that the sheer scale of American logistics was laid bare. This was not just a heap of food scraps. This was a continuous cascade of military material, torn but structurally intact tents, lengths of communication wires snapped off after temporary use, half-used tins of motor oil, unbroken glass bottles of soda. A luxury unfathomable to the Japanese high command, and mountains of heavy canvas uniforms, discarded merely because they had minor rips or stains. The soldiers, driven by a primal need for caloric survival, became expert forensic scavengers. They learned to distinguish the low rumble of a midnight refuse truck, the signal that the dump was about to be refreshed with new supplies, from the sound of a regular supply convoy heading to the front. They analyzed the depth of the burial pits. They noted the density of the defensive wiring around the dump perimeter, understanding that the enemy placed higher priority on protecting the integrity of the living spaces than on defending the actual refuse itself, treating the zone of plenty as merely a biological inconvenience. The patrols found that the Americans rarely bothered to booby-trap the actual interior of the dumps, assuming any local interference would be limited to stray animals. Instead, they focused their perimeter defenses on the main camp, This asymmetry allowed the Japanese to risk the dash into the refuse zone, sometimes staying for mere minutes, scooping up anything remotely edible, a cracked water container, a usable length of rope, or, most critically, the heavy-duty paper and cardboard packaging that could be used as fuel or insulation against the incessant rains. They were not fighting soldiers anymore, it seemed, but the very byproduct of a logistical tidal wave. Every discarded item, every partially filled fuel drum, every broken tool was a physical testament to a war economy that operated on a scale the Japanese Empire could only dream of. The smell of this waste, this shocking abundance, was not the smell of defeat, but the smell of systemic exhaustion. The slow, creeping realization that there was simply no way to bleed an enemy whose blood was constantly being replaced by an less flow of untouched material. July 19th, 1944, on the outskirts of the American logistical hub on Saipan. What they saw next transcended mere waste. It was a geological event. These were not mere dumps. They were artificial mesas, great plateaus built entirely of refuse, sometimes 20 feet high, spanning acres carved ruthlessly into the jungle landscape. They were called simply the boneyards by the Seabees who maintained them, but to the few surviving Japanese stragglers who stumbled upon them, they appeared like the colossal ruins of a defeated, ancient civilization. Except this civilization was clearly winning. A Japanese soldier, often forced to forage for grubs or boil tree roots for sustenance, would stare blankly at pyramids of discarded sea ration cans, many still filled with half-eaten peaches, untouched biscuits, or premium tobacco that the Americans didn't prefer. This food represented weeks of caloric security for an entire starving imperial unit, yet here it lay, oxidizing in the sun, rejected only for minor dents in the packaging or because the flavor profile had been superseded by a newer shipment. The sheer volume of discarded tires was staggering. Dozens of perfectly good Jeep and truck tires, tossed aside simply because the treadwear was deemed suboptimal by American quartermaster standards. For the Japanese, a single usable tire required hours of dangerous transport and meticulous conservation. Here, they formed vast, oily black rings around the edges of the dump, casually waiting to be burned or pushed into the ocean. The scale of the destruction, or rather, the intentional abandonment, was the most corrosive force the Japanese encountered. It suggested not only infinite replacement capacity, but also an absolute lack of concern for the material itself. The mechanical refuse told an even darker story. Radios, needing only a minor vacuum tube replacement, were shattered and abandoned rather than shipped back for refurbishment. Machine tools, slightly misaligned, lay rusting alongside entire stacks of broken but repairable field generators. The imperial military doctrine, honed by decades of scarcity and resource constraints, mandated that every single piece of machinery, every nut and bolt, was a sacred item to be salvaged, repaired, and reused until it literally disintegrated. The American military doctrine appeared to mandate the opposite. Use it until it slightly inconveniences you, then bury it and call in 3 more replacements. This colossal, careless monument to excess became the ultimate strategic weapon. It wasn't the superior firepower of the American artillery that truly broke the morale of the deferrers. It was the realization that the Americans had so much material wealth that they could afford to simply bury their operational failures. The waste signaled the absolute hopelessness of resistance. It was the physical manifestation of a nation capable of fighting an industrial war with such profound indifference to cost that its supply line became a weapon of psychological terror. Imagine the horror of finding mountains of untouched medical supplies, bandages still wrapped, unopened vials of penicillin, thousands of morphine syrettes discarded because the expiration date was only 6 months away, or because the packaging style had changed. While the Japanese Medical Corps struggled to treat gangrene with vinegar and torn strips of uniform cloth, the Americans were literally throwing away life-saving medicine deemed marginally stale. The soldiers of the emperor had been taught to view themselves as spiritually superior, capable of outlasting a soft, materialistic enemy. They had been told that American industrial might was brittle, dependent on smooth logistics, and prone to break down under hardship. But looking down into these canyons of discards, inhaling the bitter smell of wasted fuel and rotting untouched food, the Japanese soldiers understood that the American logistical machine did not merely supply the war effort. The machine itself was the war effort. They were not fighting men. They were fighting a factory that never closed, and a consumer culture that valued disposal over preservation. The true enemy was not the Marine with the rifle, but the incomprehensible economic engine standing behind him, casually dumping more resources than Japan possessed in its national reserves. This realization often struck hardest in the dead of night, when desperation drove weary Japanese patrols to the very fringes of the American perimeter, to the burn pits and the disposal sites. The mission was terrifying, yet essential. They risked sniper fire and trip flares merely to stand knee-deep in the refuse of the world's most powerful army. The smell was a nauseating cocktail of diesel, rotting food, burnt paper, and chlorine, but within this stench lay treasures beyond measure. The first item they universally hunted were the discarded sea rations. American soldiers, bored by the monotony of field food, or having eaten only the sweet components, routinely tossed away the savory tins. Finding a perfectly sealed, half-eaten can of meat and beans or ham and lima beans was a lottery win. These were not the meager, dehydrated rations allocated to the emperor's soldiers. These were immediate, dense sources of energy, often supplemented by packets of sugar, coffee, or even miniature tins of processed fruit, thrown out because the American consumer had simply reached his caloric capacity. The psychological impact of finding perfectly edible, high-quality food being discarded was almost paralyzing. The Japanese soldier, taught austerity and forced to subsist on roots, insects, and carefully measured rice rations, encountered an enemy who viewed these necessities as exable packaging. Beyond sustenance, there was the unimaginable luxury of tobacco. Whole cartons, often slightly crushed or damp from rain, were regularly excavated from the periphery of the dumps. American GIs, supplied by less convoys, might discard an entire pack of Camels because the paper wrapping was torn, or toss a tin of pipe tobacco because they preferred a fresh, untouched supply. For the imperial soldier, tobacco was an almost mythical substance, a relic of peacetime. To discover hundreds of cigarettes carelessly thrown away was not just a windfall, it was evidence of an abundance that defied all military logic, a resource war fought entirely in the sphere of morale and comfort. But the true indicator of the economic chasm lay in the discarded equipment. American logistics operated on a philosophy of rapid replacement, not repair. A boot with a slightly loose sole, a canvas field bag with a minor tear, a metal helmet with a superficial dent. These items were not returned to depot. They were incinerated or buried. Japanese scavengers pulled out discarded M1 Garand slings, still serviceable, to replace their worn leather straps. They gathered half-full tins of insect repellent and antiseptic bandages, supplies their own medical corps could barely dream of providing. The holy grail, often discovered amidst the rust and refuse, was the functional fighting gear. A slightly bent shovel, a pristine bayonet sheath, or even a pair of American binoculars with lenses merely fogged by humidity. These pieces of equipment, considered marginal or disposable by the Americans, were immediately pressed into frontline service, cherished, and often renamed as Lucky Charms. In the glow of a low-burning fire deep behind the Japanese lines, soldiers would share their spoils, chewing on the unfamiliar sweet taste of discarded American chocolate, or puffing on a lucky strike retrieved from the foulest corner of the dump. It was a moment of fleeting relief, purchased at great risk. But every bite and every puff served only to sharpen the realization that they were not just losing the fight for ground or for air superiority. They were losing the war against an industrial behemoth whose casual waste was greater than their entire nation's capacity to produce. The American trash dump was not merely a site of scavenging. It was a physical manifestation of defeat, a monument built of surplus and indifference. January 29th, 1944. A refuse collection point just outside the perimeter defenses of Bougainville. For the Imperial Army soldier, the most immediate and debilitating failure of the supply chain was often found not in ammunition shortages, but in the miserable quality of what was meant to protect their feet. In the unforgiving climate of the Pacific Islands, where fungal infections, jungle rot, and constant moisture made every step a potential source of crippling injury, the standard-issue Japanese boot offered woefully inadequate protection. They were typically constructed of thin, cheap leather, or, more often, canvas reinforced with crude rubber, wearing through in a matter of weeks, leaving the soldiers exposed to pathogens and sharp coral. A combat veteran was frequently distinguished by the festering, bandage-wrapped state of his lower legs, often victims of equipment failure, long before they saw an American rifle. This reality made the scavenged prizes of the American dumps profoundly humiliating. Among the discarded K-rations and dented fuel drums, the Japanese scouting parties consistently discovered piles of American combat boots. These were not the flimsy, quickly ruined footwear they themselves were forced to wear. These were high-laced, heavy-gauge leather boots, engineered for sustained campaigning and built to resist the elements that destroyed the Japanese equivalent in days. Sometimes, the boots were only slightly scuffed, deemed unfit for reissue by stringent quartermaster rules because of a loose stitch or a superficial scratch. Other times, they were perfectly serviceable, thrown out simply because the size was overstock or the model had been subtly updated. To the desperate Japanese soldier, this material was revolutionary. A single pair of discarded American boots meant the difference between marching on secure, dry feet or facing guaranteed evacuation due to infection. It was a trade-up from a death sentence to merely a risky engagement. The psychological impact of lacing up enemy boots built with a level of durability their own nation could not afford its frontline fighters, was devastating. It provided a direct, tactile comparison that transcended propaganda and official casualty reports. The realization settled in bitterly. The United States was capable of producing boots of such quality and in such quantity that an acceptable margin of error included throwing away thousands of perfectly good pairs. Their logistical system viewed high-quality leather footwear as a replaceable commodity, a piece of industrial output so easily generated that its disposal cost less than the administrative effort required to repair or formally recycle it. The Japanese soldier, fighting for the emperor and sacrificing everything, was forced to beg scraps of leather and rubber from the refuse of an enemy who treated durability and comfort as mere bulk byproducts of their manufacturing might. It was impossible to maintain the fervent belief in Japanese industrial superiority or even parity when standing knee-deep in discarded American goods that were superior to anything their factories could ship overseas. Every pair of salvaged boots was a silent, eloquent testament to an industrial disparity that no amount of martial spirit or individual sacrifice could overcome. The American trash dumps didn't just provide sustenance and material. They provided a clear, undeniable education in the fundamental mechanics of the war, a contest between a fully mobilized, unstoppable economy and a starving, isolated island nation running on borrowed time and failed equipment. The sheer scale of the waste was incomprehensible to men who measured supplies in grains of rice, single rounds of ammunition, and ounces of hoarded fuel. They saw discarded K-rations, often still containing usable candy or biscuits, boots worn only slightly, medical bandages left in their sterile wraps, and packaging designed for a convenience that bordered on the offensive. This was not the picture of the enemy painted by Tokyo's propaganda broadsheets. A soft, decadent, and easily defeated force dependent on luxuries. This was an enemy whose very refuse represented more material wealth and operational capacity than entire Japanese forward supply depots. For the Americans, the trash dump was a logistical inconvenience. For the Japanese, it was a lifeline, but one that delivered a toxic dose of reality alongside its temporary relief. Every dented tin of Spam, every half-filled gasoline drum, every perfectly serviceable piece of discarded clothing screamed a single damning truth. The United States was not fighting a war of scarcity. They were fighting a war of almost unimaginable excess. They could afford to lose things, to break things, to throw things away, simply because replacing them required only a signature on a supply form back in San Francisco or Detroit, cities that felt like mythological lands of plenty to the starving men hiding in island caves. For the Japanese soldier, obtaining a working rifle, a single quinine tablet, or even a full bowl of rice was a matter of life and death, requiring perilous patrols, bureaucratic appeals that often went unanswered, or suicidal foraging missions. The concept that their enemy's surplus could sustain them was a spiritual and ideological betrayal, the psychological edifice built upon years of indoctrination. The belief that Japanese spiritual superiority, the Yamato Damashi, would inevitably overcome Western material lack collapsed upon inspection of these garbage pits. How could martial spirit defeat an industrial machine that discarded perfectly functional tools and edible food merely out of policy or convenience? The men who risked their lives sneaking past American sentries to raid a garbage pit were not just scavenging, they were receiving daily, humiliating proof that their nation's sacrifices were fundamentally inadequate. The trash dump became the ultimate, inescapable battlefield intelligence report, confirming the war was lost long before the final shots were fired in the jungles. It stripped away the last vestiges of glorious purpose, leaving behind only the cold, hard mathematics of resource depletion and annihilation. The American soldier might have seen the waste simply as part of the job. The Japanese soldier saw it as the terrifying, physical manifestation of an unstoppable, limitless giant poised to crush them. A realization far more devastating than any artillery barrage. For the starving men hidden in the jungle's gloom, the knowledge of American excess became the ultimate painful temptation. Honor, tradition, and the strict adherence to the emperor's code often dictated starvation over suor or theft, but the primal urge to survive slowly eroded these strictures. When a man had not eaten for 3 days, and the smell of half-rotted ham and beans wafted faintly on the evening breeze, doctrine faded into the background. The American garbage pit was no longer a symbol of terrifying power. It was a promise of life, guarded by death. The intelligence gathered by Japanese patrols began to shift from troop movements and mortar placements to the mapping of enemy latrines, chow halls, and most crucially, refuse dumps. These were designated as high-risk objectives, assigned only to the most desperate or the most resourceful soldiers. The operation was universally nocturnal. Under the heavy, suffocating blanket of the island night, small, silent parties would slip through the lines. They moved not toward the enemy's forward positions, but toward the rear logistical areas, the soft, wealthy underbelly of the American machine. The journey itself was a gamble. The periphery of any American camp was laced with concertina wire, trip flares, and the ever-present hazard of nervous sentries. But the proximity to the dump often magnified the danger, because the Americans were not fools. They were keenly aware that their waste acted as a deadly attractant. Some dumps were therefore deliberately left unpoliced, becoming ambush zones where a rustle of metal could instantly draw a burst of automatic fire to retrieve a few scraps of tinned food. A soldier had to navigate a landscape where every shadow might conceal an armed enemy, and every discarded oil drum was a potential coffin. Once at the pit, the scene was one of bewildering abundance, contrasted with immediate peril. American soldiers, accustomed to unlimited supplies, would discard entire trays of biscuits, partial loaves of bread gone slightly moldy, or cans that were merely dented or unpopular. The Japanese scavengers moved with the speed and silence of ghosts, sifting through the layers of tin, paper, and rotting waste. They ignored the truly spoiled meat and focused on the staples, the remnants of sugar, the grease scraped from cooking pots, even the filter tips of discarded cigarettes which, when dried, could be repurposed for local tobacco leaves. The ultimate prize was the partially consumed sea ration, sometimes only opened and rejected because the particular flavor was disliked. A small tin of peaches, barely half-eaten, represented caloric reserves that could fuel a platoon for another day of desperate fighting. They meticulously emptied old toothpaste tubes for the tiny residual amounts, collected discarded bandages, and even retrieved worn-out bootlaces, which were stronger than their own rotting gear. Everything carried back was purified by fire or water, if available, but the sheer desperation often meant consuming items that carried a grave risk of infection or disease. In the morning, the patrolling Americans would find signs of the night's activity, a few misplaced tins, faint footprints leading back toward the jungle, and occasionally a grim testament to the operation's failure. A Japanese body, stiffened by the tropic chill, often lay sprawled near the refuse pile, a bullet hole marking the final, fatal attempt to secure a meal. For the American soldier, these dumps were symbols of convenience. For the Japanese soldier, they were the front line of a brutal economic war, fought with bare hands against an insurmountable industrial advantage. The ultimate humiliation was that survival now depended not on martial skill or samurai spirit, but on the charity of the enemy's garbage. August 16th, 1944, deep within the American perimeter on Guam. The morning air carried the stench of decaying fruit and burned gasoline. The GIs guarding the sprawling collection points did not call them trash dumps. They called them ladnyape, or sometimes just the buffet. They were magnets, drawing the desperate, starving enemy out of the jungle like shadows responding to a dinner bell. This phenomenon quickly shifted from an operational nuisance to a critical piece of psychological warfare. The American command structure understood immediately that observing the Japanese scavenging was as valuable as intercepting their radio traffic. For the young Marines, tired of the monotony of patrol, the nightly visits to the scrap heaps provided a perverse form of entertainment, a confirmation of their immense good fortune. They were fighting men who, despite the heat and the danger, knew they would receive a hot meal, clean water, and replacements for worn-out boots. The Japanese, conversely, were fighting men whose immediate objective was the retrieval of a discarded tin of Libby's corned beef or a half-full canteen of stale water. The contrast was a visceral daily lesson in the nature of the Pacific War. Security protocols around the dumps tightened, not just to prevent Japanese access, though booby traps and trip flares became standard operating procedure, but to enhance observation. Lieutenants received specific instructions to monitor patterns. What were the Japanese prioritizing? Rations, medicine, tools. Surprisingly, it was often simple clothing and footwear, highlighting that the Imperial supply system had failed not only on the front lines, but at the most basic level of material urance. The American soldier, often prone to complaining about his surplus of equipment, now saw the tactical advantage embedded in that very excess. When a bulldozer broke a track and was simply pushed aside because a replacement could be flown in, or when crates of slightly oxidized but perfectly edible canned peaches were discarded to make room for fresh supplies, the act was not merely wasteful. It was a deliberate statement of industrial might. This abundance was the true weapon. While the Japanese military preached the doctrine of spirit over matter, the Americans demonstrated daily that matter, specifically the sheer, overwhelming volume of it, was winning the war. The psychological impact extended beyond simple morale boosting. It bred a certain cold contempt among the American ranks, replacing respect for a tenacious foe with pity for a starving animal. It reinforced the propaganda that Japan was a doomed, backward empire attempting to fight a modern industrial giant. When a patrol discovered a dead Japanese soldier clutching an empty ration can, bearing the stamp of the United States Army Quartermaster Corps, the message was unmistakable. The enemy was literally sustained and then killed by the logistical overflow of the American war machine. Some officers began to manipulate the dumps strategically. Areas known to be accessible were occasionally seeded with old, useless schematics or propaganda leaflets wrapped around discarded cigarette packs, ensuring they would fall into enemy hands. The most potent form of propaganda, however, required no printing press. It was the towering heap of broken machine parts, spoiled ammunition, and half-used medical supplies. The sight of this material wealth, carelessly tossed aside, spoke volumes about the inexhaustible reserves feeding the American effort. It drove home to the desperate Japanese soldier that he was not fighting men. He was fighting Detroit, Pittsburgh, and the entire unmatched economic furnace of the North American continent. The realization, often reached while digging through fetid refuse under the nose of a watchful American sentry, crushed the samurai spirit more effectively than any frontal assault. Survival was dependent on the waste produced by the enemy's indifference. January 29th, 1945, 2 p.m., at a nameless, muddy clearing on Luzon. The spiritual violence of this necessity surpassed the physical horrors of the battlefield. The soldiers of the Emperor were trained to view themselves as divine instruments, inheritors of an unbroken warrior tradition stretching back millennia. They were taught the purity of the battlefield, the honor of ritual death, and the transcendent superiority of the Japanese spirit over the crass materialism of the West. Yet, here they were, reduced to rooting through discarded cans and half-eaten sweets, their survival predicated on the sheer, unbridled wastefulness of the enemy they were meant to despise. The items recovered were not mere sustenance. They were indictments of the Imperial General Staff. A Japanese soldier might receive one damp sack of rice every few weeks, often worm-eaten. An American trash pile yielded unopened cans of corned beef, cigarettes carelessly discarded due to a minor dent in the packaging, even entire unused lengths of wire or serviceable tools the Americans deemed too dirty to keep. The medical supplies found, sulfa drugs, fresh bandages, quinine, were a treasure trove, often better stocked than the forward aid stations of entire Japanese divisions, which relied on prayer and the stoicism of the wounded. This shame was compounded by the material truth of the enemy's casual abundance. To find an American soldier had tossed out a nearly full tube of toothpaste because he preferred a different brand, while Japanese troops fought debilitating gum disease, created a deep, festering cynicism. The concept of the spiritual victory vanished instantly when faced with the incontrovertible evidence of a nation that could supply such a colossal army with infinite redundancy. The Americans weren't just winning the war. They were doing it effortlessly, with goods to spare. The soldier who survived the New Guinea campaign or the island-hopping battles, having subsisted on American refuse, returned to the dwindling main force carrying a psychological contagion more dangerous than malaria: defeatism. This wasn't the panic of retreat, but a cold intellectual certainty of futility. How could the Yamato spirit triumph against an enemy that measured victory not in courage, but in tons of discarded steel and mountains of untouched provisions? This erosion fostered a lasting skepticism that fundamentally undercut imperial pride. When propaganda claimed the Americans were weak, lazy, and morally bankrupt, the Japanese veteran had only to recall the vast, sterile, well-preserved quality of the American field rations he had risked his life to steal. He knew the lie. He knew the difference between the desperate, ragged urines preached by Tokyo and the overwhelming, almost insolent efficiency of the industrialized foe. After the war, this cohort of survivors carried this memory home. The men who had depended on the generosity of the enemy's garbage were forever inoculated against the myth of imperial invincibility. They understood with brutal clarity that the great economic engine of the West was not simply a factor in the war, it was the war. The defeat was not merely military. It was the catastrophic realization that the empire had chosen to fight an industrial titan using spiritual willpower and antiquated notions of honor, ensuring a defeat that was total, humiliating, and utterly predictable the moment they first saw the contents of an American trash dump. The shame yearned, transforming future generations' views of national capability and realistic geopolitical power, marking the permanent of the samurai dream against the age of mass production.